And welcome back to Inside the War Room. Been on a slight hiatus here, but we are back now and back with one of my favorite guests, the man, the myth, the guy who is taking an inflationary victory lap himself, Mark Rossano, or the Mr. Flamethrower. However, what do you go by now?
Yeah, I like the flamethrower. I wore that with a badge of honor. I thought that was good.
Okay, well, good. It's good to have you back on.
Well, thanks for having me.
So let's talk. And let's just start with inflation. Where are we
Sure.
at in the inflationary picture? Are we close to the top of the bubble? The bubble about to pop? Has the bubble
Right.
started? As things start to ease? Where are we at?
The one thing that everyone keeps pointing towards is commodities, and
Mhm,
yes, like commodities is the front is the tip of that spear.
mhm.
And now you're starting to see commodities roll over. You're starting to see a little bit of a slowdown. And by commodities, I'm talking more iron ore, copper. You're starting to see some abatement of the price increases. But when you look at the inflation structure, you have to look at the whole supply chain. So when we go through it all, we're looking at where is the US going to buy stuff from? It's Japan, it's South Korea, it's Taiwan, it's China, it's Germany. So then when you go into their internals and you look at their prices paid versus prices received, prices paid being what did they pay for the item, and then prices received of what did they charge. And when you look at the just the delta or the difference between the two, there's still more price that can get passed through. Or maybe they just hold things constant and they say, look, well, our prices are coming down a bit. We're not going to pass on more. But then you take it to the coast and you look at container rates, and container rates are through the roof again.
Mhm.
Then you come into the US, now you're in the US where we have a shortage of truck drivers. We have an increase in diesel prices, an increase in just trucker rates. Then you start assembling all of this, and there's still more to come when you look at the whole cycle. But when does it end, and when does the consumer essentially say, look, I can't tolerate it? When does the market push back? And I think we're starting to get a little bit closer to that point, which instead of seeing deflation, I think we're going to start to see more stagflation. Because when you look at, okay, well, companies are going to try to recover as much as they can, but now you have rents going back up. You have food continuing to rise. You have some other pieces that used to be deflationary that are now going to be inflationary. So yes, gasoline prices may just kind of stay here and not continue to drive up month over month. But what about rents? What about food? These other things that have been that have lagged throughout COVID. And then not to rant for too long, but then take it to the next level and say, okay, well, how are we, what about labor? We're seeing a lot of this without new labor, without wages going up. So now not only did you have the raw material side, but what happens when people, you really have to start paying higher wages to come back? Well, wages get passed right down to the consumer. So how much of that can get passed through? So there's so many different pieces where we're far from over in terms of just where this inflationary price increases are going to go.
So where is the job market? Ellen and I yesterday on Energy Week talked about there could be fuel shortages this summer because a lack of truckers. So not because
Right.
of lack of fuel, not because of lack of supply, not because refineries are shut down. There's not enough truckers to get the potentially to get the fuel to the gas stations as we hit summer demand.
Mhm.
Now, when you hear that, the trade association was saying that the truckers, 20 to 25% of the trucks were parked. This was in part because people had left for other jobs, A, or B, hadn't returned to the workforce. I haven't looked at the unemployment data lately, but how much of this unemployment problem, or for a problem like that, are we seeing? Is it because people are, staying at home getting paid, or have they just moved and we're going to see problems in the economy just because people shifted jobs last year?
I think that's the bigger issue, is the shifting of jobs when you look at just the skill set. Because we talk about the JOLTS data, we talk about the beverage curve in terms of just where things are, where job openings never really fell to the level that you would have expected based on how steep the decline was. Instead, we just kind of went sideways, where unemployment rates exploded, but job openings never really stopped. And you see this weird flat line when you look at the curve in general. And now you're starting to see this reopening. But what does it take? So then you take your example of gasoline, which for those that may not be aware, gasoline is very flammable. So you need a federally mandated
Mark,
license.
breaking news on the podcast. Gasoline is
There we go.
flammable.
There should be a red bar that goes across. Gasoline is flammable.
It's just in.
And so when you think about just the ownership of it, you have to, there's risk behind it. So you need a special license for it. You need a special training for it. And when you look at where are the licenses, well, the licenses are federal. If you look at marijuana may be legal at the state level, but is still not at the federal level. So you need to meet federal drug tests in order to meet this. And then you need training. So when you look at just how, trucking, for an example, if you go back to 2018 was a boom period for trucking. You had truck companies coming up, buying new equipment, hiring new people. 2019 kind of sucked. And 2019 slowed. You had, at the end of 2019, you had two gigantic trucking companies go bankrupt, stranding, thousands of drivers on the road. And then you had obviously COVID, where on the fuel side, you didn't have the trucking demand, but you did have the trucking demand to move containers, to move stuff, because all of a sudden you had these shortages across the supply chain. Now you still have those shortages across the supply chain. You're still paying them a lot of money. So why am I going to go do short haul gasoline if I'm getting paid way more to do long haul container ships, containers? So you have this weird dynamic now where you have this massive shortage. You're increasing. I think it's like $5,000 sign-on bonus, free training, paid while you're training, bonuses for miles. So they're trying everything that they can, and it just isn't enough because of those hurdles on, as you said, skills, as well as that difficulty in getting the license.
Well, and I don't think I don't know where me and you would come down on exactly what regulatory authority the government should have, and the listeners would probably agree or disagree. But I think this is just an important time to kind of stop and say, when the government, whatever you believe about regulatory power, when they say this is essential, this is not essential, which obviously is what they did last year, and shifted so much of the economy. People had to go, go find a job, or just because you're getting unemployment doesn't mean you can pay your bills, right? And so for some of these people, they couldn't pay their bills. They might have moved, whatever. And so we're still going to deal with the ramifications of that for quite some time. And so what's going to happen, I would guess, Mark, here's your thoughts. They're going to start paying all these bonuses for truck drivers, and they will attract truck drivers because that's what the market's trying to do. They're trying to attract it. But this is going back to an inflationary problem. This is going to push up the price of gasoline or whatever else they might be carrying on these trucking companies. And then the end consumer is going to have to pick up the cost at some point. And then these truckers. So we're in a vicious cycle, it feels like, where we're dying by 1,000 cuts if we're not careful.
And that's the problem that we continue to see, which is why when we talk about inflation and we're talking about it through the supply chain, we still haven't seen the peak. And then when you look at, the old rule of thumb going back to 2014, the old rule of thumb was $3.50. $3.50 a gallon was that pivot point where people are like, you know what, I'm going to figure out a way to fill up one less time a month. And my argument has become, it's really not 350. If you look at wage compression, if you look at pressure overall in terms of COVID, in terms of other costs, ancillary costs from food to housing and other, it's really closer to $3 to $3.15. Like, I think that we are hitting a real pain point because I don't know if you've been to the grocery store anytime recently, but it's not exactly cheap. And I've never seen it ever get cheaper once things go up. And then when you look at that in general, then you start talking about shrinkflation, which is something that I've talked about before, where the actual product gets smaller, but the price stays the same. So instead of, I know you have kids.
You gotta tell the famous shrinkflation story
Okay.
about the the Easter egg. That's my favorite story.
Yeah. So the back in college, we had I had a marketing professor that would work on how people perceive. He was the one that would look at what eye level really means. So at a grocery store, eye level is actually hand level, not where your eye is, but where your hand is, because you're always going to look down to where your hand naturally goes. So we it was always about consumer perception. So he brought in essentially a fake, or a Snickers bar from 1991, a Snickers bar from 2001, and this was in '05, and one that he picked up at the gas station on the way over to class. And he laid them out. And now the one from 91 looked like a king size bar, the one that you pay an extra $2 for. That was the regular one. That was at the end, I think it was $1.10 cheaper
Right.
than the one from 2005. And then the one in 2005, you could have fit two of them within the size of the one that was in 1991. So when you look at just the shrinkage of the unit itself, and there's no innuendo in that at all, but when you think about the overall, that everything getting smaller, while prices are either staying flat or really just going up. So then, and then as someone who has kids, I know, myself who has kids, then you're buying what you could feed a family with one. Now you're buying 1.5, or you're buying two. So your prices are still going up, even though based on how they calculate it, the price never changed. Well, it's like, well, it did though. Like it
Right.
got smaller. So I bought more.
Well, that's a good point. So we have a family of 6. So we know if we go get something that says family size, it doesn't matter. It's not probably gonna. Now I've got 2 kids, one's 5 and 2, so they don't eat a whole lot. But I'm a big boy myself, and I've got a son who's 13, almost as tall as me. So yeah, we can put down some groceries.
Right.
But we know if we get something that says family size, that it's not probably going to feed our family. And that's fine.
Mhm.
But it feels like the family size is kind of getting smaller, but the label's staying the same. And to your
Right.
point about the king size, this has been, I don't know, a couple years now. It's fascinating to hear you talk about that, because Snickers, now they have 2 bars in one package. And
Mhm.
if you start to kind of compress them to one end, you find that there's a lot of air
Yep.
in that package. And they didn't make it so that you could have 2 bite-sized Snickers. They
Right.
did that so that you would feel like you're getting more. But in reality, the amount of extra space inside the wrapper is a lot more than it used to be.
And that's why you always look at the weight, and you look at the weight, and then you can break it down by unit price. And this is where they try to game you. And the class that I took, there's an actual calculation to figure out at what point does the consumer recognize it's smaller. And then you go down the ice cream aisle, because I mean, who doesn't love the ice cream aisle? And you go to Ben and Jerry's, and Ben and Jerry's whole shtick is still a pint, but look at the price. If you remember what those prices were, I mean, you could have when Ben and Jerry's wasn't on sale, it was 250. When it was on sale, it was 2 for 250. Now it's 5.99. It's 5.69. So just do the percentages on that. Like you're talking about a sheer, but it's not their fault. They're trying to say, look, we're still a pint. We're still going to give you the quality. We're still going to give you the stuff, but it costs more. And
Right.
I'm going to have to pass that on to you. Otherwise, I'm going to have to get interesting with packaging. I'm going to have to make it a little bit smaller, take some stuff out of it. If you get the chubby hubby, it won't have as much, things in it to save cost. And that's, again, those are things that we're seeing that's taking away from the underlying consumer. Now, look at sales. Sales have gotten worse in terms of there's less of them. The quality of the discount isn't the same. And when you look at the promotions on everything from phones to internet and other, you'll still get a promotion when yours expires, but it's not going to take you to where you were. It's going to be $30 higher than where it initially was.
Right. And so what you're seeing, it feels like on the promotional side, is things like streaming services. They are bundling and they're
Mhm.
attaching to like phone plans and to auto loans and to refinancing your mortgage, things like that. Feel like they're trying to latch on. And I don't know that, because I guess the business model is a little bit different there. It's not a physical product having to be created. It's a repeat subscription business.
Right.
I think moving forward, it's going to be interesting to kind of see how these things play out, because we're sitting around going, okay, God, we've got 4,000 subscriptions now. HBO Max comes with our cell phone, so it's not cost us anything, but we wouldn't keep it without that.
Right.
We have YouTube TV. Now they got in a big dispute with Roku, and now they're kind of so almost cut it for that because I only watch it for the sports. Then we have you
Mhm.
start going through all this stuff, and it feels like if you go to the streaming world, which is not the same as the ice cream world, but you are kind of seeing people trying to figure out, who is going to give them the most bang for their buck. And the ironic part is prior to 2020, everyone was trying to cut off their own piece of the pie, right? So everyone was trying to cut off a sliver and get that. But now we're at a spot to where people were probably looking for consolidation. And so
Mhm.
when you look at like a physical market, ice cream can't consolidate. I mean, I guess they can consolidate at the top, but you can
Right.
only sell so much ice cream, or you can only sell so much Snickers. Do you think it would be best interest for these companies to put like two Snickers bars side by side, like the true king size, and that's the OG king versus the 2020 the post COVID king size, just to see how it would work? That'd be an interesting experiment, in terms of
Yeah.
prices.
No, and that's where it would be interesting to see just how that has changed, and the question's always going to come down to, like as you said, you wouldn't renew HBO Go. There are things where at what point does the consumer reject? And that's going to be the pivot point as to when does inflation really stop, or do you start to see some pressure going the other way? The other side to it, because you bring up a good point with some of the technology, because like you said, Snickers, I can put Snickers next to each other. I can look at them. I can see like, this is the OG. This is what it was.
Right.
This is what it is now. But when you start looking at, what has the US done for the last 25 years? We've exported inflation.
Yeah.
We have gone abroad. We have, okay, well, we can go to China or Taiwan or, Vietnam, Malaysia, and I'm going to have a 30% savings cost. So even though it's going to cost me more to ship, obviously, I'm going to have a net savings. So we've been exporting this inflation, importing deflation. Well, what has been more deflationary over the last 20 years than technology? So you've had labor and tech that have only gotten cheaper, but now we're at this bottom point, and you're seeing it with semiconductors. Where the semiconductor prices are no longer cheap. When you look at cars, car prices are going up for a lot of reasons, obviously, but semiconductors is a big piece of it, and technology continues to get put in. But now we're going to start importing it, because then the last cycle was, as what is it, running asset light, so less inventory at time deliveries. All of that sounds great until you have a supply disruption. And what bigger supply disruption can we think of over the last 50 years than
The China
COVID?
trade war. Oh, COVID. Sorry.
Yeah.
So 2019. Sorry.
Right. We gotta go forward. Gotta go forward. And when you look at just how short inventories are on just the US level, because you might say, look, I get what you're saying, Mark. I get that there's shortages, prices are going up. Well, just live from inventory. Well, inventories are at historic lows. So you have no choice. You have to pay the going rate. And there was a story from a client who said that they had a cargo that they needed to get on a ship, and they said, I will pay you whatever price you want to get on that boat. And the guy just said, there's literally no price you can pay me to get on there, because there is no room, and it would take me too much time to replace someone. So there is physically nothing you can do to get on that boat.
Well,
And that's what we're sitting in right now.
so let's talk about I want to talk about semiconductors, but let's go back to importing and exporting, inflation and
Mhm.
deflation. And I made the joke about the Trump trade war with China. But I don't know if me and you've ever spoken about this part of this offline or not. So I'm curious your thoughts. But one of the things that we were working on a deal to import from South Africa, some green tubes, and we were concerned about getting hit with anti-dumping violation. It was kind of weird because that's not a business. I was just brokering the deal, or helping. I say broker. I was gonna be the importer, but I'm not. And so, but I don't deal in that space, so I have no idea what the market price is, right? And so we talked to these international attorneys, and they're like, "Oh, well, if it's not market price," I'm like, "Well, how would I know it's market price? Like, I'd have to call people that I'd be wanting to sell to and ask them, is this
What
market
market
price?"
prices? Yeah.
Right. Now, if I'm getting it for undervalue, what are they going to say? They're going to say, "Yeah, that's market price. Sell it to me." Right. So it was kind of a weird thing. And I was going to import it, and then I had a buyer that was going to buy it. Um, and so the thesis is that the US government is trying to prevent South Africa or China or Vietnam or wherever from their government subsidizing the cost on their end so that when
Mhm.
the US brings it in, it's not overly competitive for the Vietnam side or the Chinese side or whatever. So, for instance, if a tube costs $1,000 in the U.S., it needs to be, I'm making this up, 950 to 1150 from South Africa or wherever. It doesn't need to be 400 because the Vietnam government subsidized it, right? And so the issue became um, is that you start thinking about that and go, okay, well, if the South African government is going to subsidize, and the deal never got done, so I don't know, but I'll keep using South Africa.
Right.
But if the South African government is going to subsidize $500 of this, who is that impacting? That's impacting the South African side. They're
Mhm.
losing money on the deal. Now, I understand there's an argument about U.S. jobs we could talk about in a second, but by and large, if foreign nations want to subsidize their economy at the benefit for the U.S., it's hard to argue at that high level that we should be against that. We should go, okay, thanks, guys. You're helping boost our economy faster. What
Mhm.
is your read on that? Now, there's an extreme that I think we got to deal with, but at that level, are you okay with those policies, or do you think the anti-dumping policies should be in place and try to make the market competitive?
Well, I think the idea is making it competitive because how sustainable is that? And the problem is if you then undercut the market to such a percent that you then kill it essentially, and then when they say, oh, by the way, it's not going to be 500 anymore, it's going to be zero, and then actually we're going to add something on top of it because I took out your competition, I took out my competition. And if you're willing to operate at a loss, then the question is, well, how long can you sustain that? And if you
Right.
can sustain it long enough to essentially force everyone else to go bankrupt. And that's
Agreed.
that's the underlying problem. Now, if there's going to be some sort of competition in the sense of, well, they're going to subsidize it to get it off the ground, but then those subsidies will essentially go away. There's rules within the WTO that allow for emerging markets, frontier markets, to have a certain amount of advantages in order to enable them to get some sort of head start. But then they're capped at one percentage, how long they can do it. And then on a dumping side, what is the going rate and how far below are you? Because at the same time, they also want to protect slave labor and other
Sure.
types of mispractices at the South African level to achieve those types of prices. So I think that there's a place for it. It's just what is the percentage? Because sometimes, as you're saying, you're going to get artificially impacted where it's like, is it really the right thing? But then it's like, well, no, but it doesn't have to be 500. It could be,
Right.
200 with, and then you could come up with a way to pare that back where over the next 5 years, it's going to go from 200 to 150
Sure.
to 100, and then you'll be within that. So now you have people that like the quality, like the product, like you have the relationship, and you're still going to be able to undercut a little bit, but not within a margin of error that keeps everyone happy.
Agreed, and that's right. I agree that if in a theoretical world, China came out tomorrow and said that we are going to give all cars, trucks, cars, SUVs, like we're just giving them away. And Ford and GM were like, oh, okay, we're out of business, right?
Right.
That would be a concern. Like you should go, oh my goodness gracious, like this is not good, right? There,
Mhm.
so that's the extreme that you have to watch for. Now, how long can China sustain that's a question that you have to deal with, but there are the extremes of the concern. However, um, it feels like the discussion that doesn't happen is why can they offer cheaper labor? Now, sometimes it is nefarious. It is the blood diamond stuff that you hear about. It is pretty bad. And other times it's just U.S. domestic policy, which is artificially driving up the cost of doing business here. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, hey, they're competitive. Well, yeah, they have a little bit cheaper labor, but also their energy costs are cheaper, their taxes are cheaper. Maybe we should rethink the policy on our side before boosting the price internationally.
Well, and that's when you start looking at processing, and we always talk about how we greenwash a lot of the manufacturing of renewable energy and all of these other things because we've taken the dirty side of it all and exported it. So not only are you getting the discount, but you don't have to meet the same environmental standards in these other areas that you have to meet if you're producing this in Oklahoma or Texas. So by doing that, you're also reducing costs, because then you're reducing the environmental impact. You're taking a dirty process and moving it to a place that's not going to regulate it to the same level, if at all, which also takes away some of that cost. And that's where that you have this virtue signaling of, well, look at what we're doing. But then you also have the issue of, and I have a bunch of charts on just how much processing of iron ore, steel, copper that China really does. And at what point do they say, yeah, we don't feel like giving it away anymore, or we don't feel like exporting it anymore, we're just going to keep it in house? Now you've exported a lot of this processing, and you're beholden to what the market can bear.
Yeah, no, there is a concern. It feels like,
And I'm not saying that you pollute blindly. Like, I'm not saying that you bring it back and you say like, oh, just let them do whatever they want. That is not what I'm saying. There is a balance. Yeah,
that was the headline. Mark Rossano hates Earth.
Right. Gasoline is flammable, and Mark hates planet.
Literally wants to burn the planet.
Yeah. So it's when you start looking at pollution, you have to think about, well, is there a carbon capture? Is there a carbon tax? Is there something that can be done to mitigate it, but not to be onerous to the sense where you're going to send it to some place that is then going to pollute way more than you ever would in the name of science? But yes, that makes our numbers look good, but the other country is going to pollute more. And based on the way the atmosphere works, we're still going to be in the same situation that we were previously.
Okay, so semiconductors, let's talk about that. You were the first one I remember here talking about this. And I remember getting on, I was considering getting I got a Mac right here. So I was considering getting a new Mac a few months ago. And I went to their website, and it said that they didn't have the whatever processor that I wanted, the Intel. They had some other processor. And I was like, okay, I'm not really sure if that's tied up with semiconductors or not. But then you start seeing like Ford and GM, like everyone, like poof, everyone started talking about semiconductors. And it felt like overnight we went from, the flamethrower, the fifth horseman, is like to call you, the fifth horseman, talking about it too. Everyone talking about it. How pervasive is this problem? Is it like, if I buy a new Mac, is it impacting that? Is it impacting my phone? Should you hold off on buying technology unless you absolutely have to? Like, what's going on with this problem?
It's multifaceted in the sense of, where did this problem really originate? So it goes back to, we were already supposed to be tight on supply coming into 2021, but this was known coming out of 2019, because their foundries take a long time to build, they're expensive, and that we have new facilities coming online starting in 2023, which would then alleviate some of these pressures. So you already had some tightness coming in, just because demand was still moving higher and supply was getting tighter. Now take that, and then you talk about China and the U.S., and you look at Huawei sanctions. So what is Huawei going to do ahead of sanctions? They then go out and buy as many semiconductors as their market can bear, to kind of buffer against some of these potential sanctions. So then you had that happening. Then you had two new phones in terms of Apple and Samsung. Now the iPhone was new in the sense where it was going to be 5G capable, and Samsung was going to have its second iteration of 5G capacity. So there was an assumption that you were going to get a big step up in demand as people went from 4G to 5G. So you already had this backdrop. Now you drop in COVID of completely screwed up supply chains, foundries closing down, not being able to produce, not being able to get the raw materials. And then that got extrapolated out, because then you had people who had delayed buying a car, delayed buying stuff. And now you have people buying, more things because they have a little bit more money. They're not going to watch, the Giants lose or the Mets be the Mets. They're sitting at home and they're watching it on their television, not spending that money, which is going into other sides of the
Not buying
the supply chain
package either.
Yeah. Yeah, then when you take it to the ground level and you say, okay, well, how do you make a chip? Well, there's a lot of water and there's a lot of electricity. Well, let's look at the shortage of water. And then you take Taiwan, which has been under a drought warning for now about 18 months. So they limit the amount of water that can be consumed, and they've just started experiencing rolling brownouts because there's not even enough water behind the dam to generate the electricity necessary. So you have these continuous problems when you look at just the overarching supply chain. Now you take demand. I mean, it's gotten to a point now where even light bulbs have semiconductors in them because they're connected to Wi-Fi, so you can control the lights from your phone. You know that you have a connected home. So we continue to see the adoption of types of chips, whether it be logic, whether it be user interface, whether it be memory. You have just this plethora of demand in all the smallest places that you don't even consider, which is why the demand has really outpaced where we should have been due to some of this tightness, but from new phone cycle. And this is one of the reasons. And I talk back and forth with people on Twitter who think this is going to be over by the end of Q4. And I just don't see that happening, just given where the shortfalls remain in the system and just where the demand continues across the market.
So something you said there made me think of EVs, and you talked about semiconductors, and they're just kind of everywhere now. Let's talk about the grid for just half a second and demand.
Mhm.
I want to talk about oil, what's going on there, in a minute. But it feels like the EV debate and where it's going, it never goes away. No matter what
Yeah.
happens, it keeps getting steaming. I don't really have a dog in the hunt if you want to own an EV or not, or whatever.
Mhm.
That's neither here nor there. But you said semiconductors are everywhere. The light bulbs, refrigerator, whatever.
Yep.
That is going to, on some level, change the grid demand in the homes because you have more smart tech. Now, it
Yep.
might be ultimately 10 years, 5 years, 20 years from now that we can reduce usage because we can be more efficient. That's quite possible. It could be that we actually just use more because we have so many more things we're wanting to power up. Like right now, I've got two lights right here. I got a little
Mhm.
fan blowing. I got a big monitor. I got this. So my grid usage today is fundamentally different than it was 10 years ago.
Right.
And so you throw in the EVs to the mix. Where are we at with our grid in the US? Can we actually take on 30% of car drivers, with EVs? A, can we produce that many? And B, can the grids sustain that amount of pull?
The answer is no. The grid can't sustain it, and that's where we've had these discussions, and I did that whole segment on the Texas freeze off, and not to say that I called the Texas freeze off, but 18 months prior, when you had California running about one or almost a full, I think it was over a megawatt short, and you just saw these rolling brownouts, you saw these issues going through. That became a bigger story because then you start looking at it and say, okay, well, what is base load versus peakers? And I think that is where the market, or at least the layman, doesn't appreciate. Base load is something that is on all the time, providing you with your just standard electricity, which is coming from natural gas, it's coming from coal, it's coming from nuclear. That is providing your base load. And now when the sun is shining, yes, solar can be base because that's happening. But when the sun goes away, well, that's no longer a base load issue. Then you look at wind. So when you start looking at these renewables and you say, okay, well, how do you create base load? Well, you have to have either an interruptible contract for natural gas backup, some sort of diesel backup, or you have to have battery backup. So now you start looking at the cost of batteries, and you start, what is a battery made of that's going to support the grid? Well, it's the same stuff that a battery is made of that goes into an EV. So then you start looking at what we've been doing, which is taking down base load and replacing it with renewables. Now you're making the grid more volatile because you don't have that baseload capacity, as we saw in Texas when you saw freeze offs and you didn't have dual fuel mandates at the natural gas facilities, and you had wind that was at 9% capacity versus the installed base. Not to say that that wasn't expected, but again, you're just looking at these problems, and now you're going to ask the grid to do more by installing additional draw from it, which is on an EV level. Now, the pushback will be, yeah, but I'm filling up at night. So you're taking something that used to be a down period where you had, peaking that would happen in the middle of the day, especially you're in Texas. So it obviously gets a little toasty. So ACs are going to peak at peak sun. And now you're going to fill up your car, if you will, or charge it in the overnight. So typically when you take things down, you're repairing, you're just creating this huge load that is not going to surge, but is just going to remain elevated. And you're not providing the grid with the sustainable nature of base capacity to handle that. So then if you get any blip in the sense of, you're going to have a heat wave for the next 7 days, usage is going to explode. They're going to have to tell you, you can't plug in your car.
Right. And so how that can work out practically is, Bob gets home from work 5:30 every day and he plugs his car in. Well, if him and, you know, everyone else does it, well, obviously you have a huge
Right.
surge at 5:30 in the afternoon. But
Yeah.
that's not how it's going to work. You're going to have Bob at 5:30 in a group, and then you're going to have, Tom at 6:30 in a group, and then someone went out to dinner, so they're going to have 7:30, and then someone forgets
Mhm.
8:30, and then someone forgets it's 9:30. And so the overall surge might not be at 5:30, but the elevation of the base load just
Right.
goes for longer periods of time.
Yes.
And so then you're in a spot you're going, wow, we've increased the base load demand. Oh, by the way, it's a cold snap right now, so turn the heaters up or
Right.
turn the or turn whatever up. And so it's a problem that doesn't get enough attention. And the other thing is can we manufacture enough EVs? Like it or like is that even possible at this point?
And that's where, when you start coming to the electrical pole. So yeah, back in 2014, I think they did a study on, if every household, not every person, if every household had an EV and plugged it in, the grid would last 3 seconds before it just said nope and just shut itself down. So now you take it from, okay, well, I'm installing renewables, so I'm either going to build a natural gas facility or battery backup. Okay, so then how many batteries does it take to provide, let's call it, 12 hours, which we all know, if you look at the dual fuel mandates, you actually need 3 days of backup power generation. But let's just say you need 12 hours because you have a solar panel. The solar panels need to go through the night. So now you're looking at how many batteries do you need? Well, how big are those batteries? Now, there's going to be an issue in terms of an EMF, or an electric magnetic field, and there's going to be the safety of the battery itself. So you can only discharge and recharge at certain speeds. So now you start doing that. So that means that that's going to limit the amount that, or extend the amount that your batteries you're going to need to store that, because it's going to limit your discharge. So now you have these entities that are competing against all of the raw materials that are going into the batteries, that everyone keeps saying they're going to keep getting cheaper. But why? How can they keep getting cheaper if the stuff going into them is seeing a perpetual increase in just capacity? Because then you think about, like, what can I get that's battery powered? I can get my phone, I can get this microphone, I can get my lawnmower, my weed whacker.
Right.
Everything has a battery option. And again, that's just more demand coming into the system. And that's where you start looking at, well, how can EV prices continue to go down? Now, another thing that I touch on a regular basis is an EV is almost 1,000 pounds heavier than the car it replaces.
Mhm.
Now you're adding 1,000 pounds and additional torque to the road.
Right.
Well, how much is that going to rip up the roads? How much? I mean, anybody who's ever driven into Houston knows that there's parking garages that go up 27 floors, and they're all filled with F-150s. So take an F-150, add 1,000 pounds to every one of them. What's the tensile strength of that parking garage? Can it handle that kind of additional weight
Mhm.
on every single level? Does it have to be reinforced? So not only do you have to worry about road conditions in terms of the thickness, the replication of them, and what about just tensile strength of bridges and parking garages and other structures that can't handle the additional weight?
And when they catch on fire, it takes like, the ocean to put them out, it seems like.
Yes, and then the question is, do you have the foam available? Do you have the water capacity?
Right.
There's been several times where they believe an EV is, the fire is out, and then 3 hours later it reignites. So you're talk about thermal runaway. Excuse me. How do you maintain thermal runaway? Because, and thermal runaway, for those that don't know, it's when two chemicals that shall never meet in an accident. And that's typically when this happens. So when they meet, they go from zero to, I'm going to melt steel in a matter of 15 minutes. And that's where you get this timing, you get these issues, and then the amount of water to put out a chemical fire versus foam. This is where you start getting these problems, not only just on training, but then the foam that they use has carcinogens in it, so now they're cancerous in its own right, and it just goes on this continuous circle of, well, we're going to pollute, but what is the best way to pollute, or the least amount of damage we can cause while we come up with something that doesn't pollute anything.
Okay, we buried the lead. Let's get to it now. Oil and gas, oil prices, your favorite topic. Looking at it right
Yes.
now, Brent's at 68,
Mhm.
WTI's at 66. How does it hit you? Do you feel good? You like those prices? You think those prices are right? Are they too high? Are they wrong? I'm poking the bear here a little bit. I'm poking.
So it's funny because everyone like thinks of me as bearish, but then if we go back in time, depending on when you knew me, I was a perma bull. So it all comes down to perception. The issue that I have with crude pricing right now is because everything you said is front month. So when we look at front month crude, and then you look at the supporting barrels that flow throughout the world, you have Nigeria that still has deferred cargoes from April. They've now taken about 200,000 barrels a day out of May and put it into June while they're issuing their loading schedules for July. Angola has cut exports because they can't clear their current deck. Congo has cut their exports because they can't clear. And but then at the same time, you're seeing some ESPO, which is just some
Hold
Russian
on, let
barrels.
me spin it here, just to make sure we're
Sugar.
you're saying that these countries have barrels that they cannot sell. Like
Yes.
no one wants to buy them. This is not the ship is full and we can't put the oil on the ship. This is, hey guys, we want to sell you oil at this
Mhm.
price. And everyone's like, nah, fam, we're good.
Yes, that
Okay.
is correct.
Just because earlier we talked about we couldn't get it on the ship, but this is the opposite. No one
Yes.
wants to put it on the ship, but there's plenty of ships to take it.
Correct.
Okay.
So and if you look, like, the amount of ships that are available keeps growing, which is why day rates have been fairly depressed when you look at just oil tankers. And when you look at India, for an example, so India skipped buying in May. Now they've put out tenders for June and July, and it was for only 3 million, which the hope was for it to be more. And you're just seeing the physical market, which as anybody knows, I always talk about, continues to price something that the paper market is ignoring. Now, people will push back and say, well, the futures market is looking into the future. It's like, well, then you should be buying December, because December is cheaper than where we're sitting right now. And what are we actually looking at? And then it gets complicated a bit further when you start talking about refined product, because there is a significant amount of refined product that is currently competing for a home. And just to take an example, like, and this is all before Colonial Pipeline, you had Saudi Arabia that sold about 1.8 million barrels of gasoline into the US market. And this was before you even had Colonial providing that price bump. So you're seeing this just get it out of my tank and into the market. And you continue to see this elevated level of just crude and refined product in storage. People like to talk about one or the other instead of looking at both. So then you take China, for an example, where everyone's like, well, China's importing more oil. It's like, yes. And they're also, I think that they've imported now 4% more oil than they did in 2019. It's like, but they've also exported 34% more product. So yes, you're importing more oil, but you're exporting more product, which is then shifting somebody's refiner can't come back up because you're saturating the refined product market. So then you look at Singapore, South Korea, Japan, Australia, where Australia decided to shut a facility. You're seeing run rates remain low because this shift is happening. And then now you look at China. China is going after Shandong or teapot refiners, and they're now they're going to put levies on light cycle oil, which is a semi-refined product. And that's gonna hurt South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, and that's going to, again, and Singapore, and that's going to kick again and shift the paradigm again. And that's why I struggle with where the demand is, where the physical market is. And then when you look at crude pricing, you're like, So I'm wrong if you just base it on pricing.
Well, that's what I was gonna say is the obvious retort is, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants, but prices are still mid 60s. How do you
Right.
explain that?
And that's when you start coming to the inflation narrative. And the inflation narrative is looking at, well, inflation's going up, dollars going down, so I'm going to buy oil as an inflation hedge. And when you start looking at the inflation side, you can say, okay, well, I get it. I understand what you're saying. But when you look at just the physical market, so then people will say, well, you're bullish. You were bullish grains forever. I was like, yes, but there was a supply demand balance I was also looking at where, yes, I thought inflation was going to be there. Buyers were coming out, but you had a supply issue. We do not have a supply issue. So the supply problem, which you could say was artificially created by OPEC, which is now being alleviated because they have to start getting back to business in some way, is going to meet whatever new demand is. Now, when I do the EIA show on YouTube, I'm showing the same data, and my whole thing is we are getting better, which I think everybody expected. The U.S. was going to reopen, we were going to get better, but to a point. And that's always been my thing, is like things are going to get better along seasonal lines, but not back to 2019, which, to be fair, 2019 wasn't even a good year. And I actually was getting bearish in 2019. So when you look at where we are in a demand cycle, we've been reopened. And I think you could at least look at Texas. Texas has been reopened. So everyone keeps talking about this grand reopening. It's like, well, what part of the country hasn't been reopened? Like what's remaining that we haven't seen yet come into the system? And that's where I struggle with this grand reopening plan that's going to push us higher.
Well, part of the problem is, unless you're following it, you turn on the mainstream media and they talk like that, right?
Right.
And so you turn on Anthony Fauci or I don't watch MSNBC or CNN or so I see clips, but you'll see a clip on the internet like, what are they talking about, man? So
Yeah.
it's a big country and it's really hard to figure out what's going on in New York City or Portland,
Right.
Oregon or Granbury, Texas. Okay, no one talks about Granbury, Texas. So and
Mhm.
demand impacts none, but it is kind of hard to follow that. And the other thing I think is interesting to your point is um, even if everything is open today, there's a psychological impact, and you can't
Yes.
measure that. We don't know, will people respond and just go balls to the wall, back, ready to go? The other thing is how much money did people spend last year to re-improve their home,
Mhm.
to buy that new laptop, and they don't have excess cash now. So there's a lot of things. I think you'll see people want to go on vacation this summer. I think you'll see that
Right.
because people haven't get to go on vacation for a while. So I think you see summer demand grow up. But beyond that, when you get to the fall, you get to the Thanksgiving, you get to Christmas, will consumer debt, credit card debt start to rise because people are out of cash? I think there's a lot of things to follow along those lines that we still don't know. And so you talk about demand. One of the bigger drivers for demand is length, right? So it's not
Yeah.
getting go to the gas station; it's going cross country or flying internationally, and
Right.
those indicators are still down.
Yes. And I think you bring up a great point, and that's one of the things that we talk about a lot on our econ show and the EIA show, is when you're looking at the consumer, but what is the consumer views of the market? And
Mhm.
Gas Buddy did a great survey. It was 186,000 people. Pew has done one. There's been several now that have looked, how do you feel? Like, will you go into a crowd? And I am perpetually shocked, and maybe I shouldn't be, but I am surprised at the amount of people that still say they will avoid crowds. They will avoid a crowded situation. And there are people that won't. I mean, and you can see it. Like the numbers are very clear. There is this sticky 25 to 35% of respondents, in which again, we're not interviewing 330 million Americans. They're interviewing a subset of anywhere from 150,000 to 500,000. But 35% of those people are still saying, I'm going to wait another 6 months. And I think, and that is, I think, this other piece of the pie that continues to get missed. And then Gas Buddy did in their report, they said, the question was, what is the biggest component of a hindrance to your travel? What are you worried about the most? And number one was price.
Mhm.
Number three was health. It was price, distance, health.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly people who are talking about this, they are vaccinated, they're looking to go, but price is number one. And 46% said that, look, price is a real issue. And to your point, because everyone's going to talk about, but, Ryan, Mark, look, disposable income, look at savings. It's like, but that's a skewed number. That's the aggregate of the United States. When you break that into its subsets, you can see that a lot of those savings are weighted towards the top 10% of the consumer, not the bottom 90%. And let's be fair, during COVID, were the top 10% really changing their spending patterns to such a way? In a way, yes, like they weren't flying, they weren't going to concerts and whatnot, but now that's back. Anybody who had that pent up demand has done it. Anyone who wanted to get vaccinated got vaccinated. And look at the pace of vaccinations. They've really come down because anybody who wanted it got it. Anybody who wants to fly can. What city can't you go to? And then, like, as you said on the news, everyone makes a big deal about New York City. New York City is not a driving area.
Right.
When Texas, that's a driving area. That's where you're going to drive 20 minutes to go to Target. If you're in New York City and you want to go to Starbucks, just point in any direction and it's going to be a block away. If you want to go to Starbucks in Texas, you're getting in the car and driving. Like when you think about the concept of just activity levels, I just think that we're going to be underwhelmed with where we shake out on this pent up demand view.
Okay, real quick. And the other thing I think that can't be measured, it's going to be a small subset, but it will be there, is people who are afraid to go out after seeing everything that's happened in the last 12 months or so. I'm talking about COVID fights over mask, non-mask. I'm talking about people getting in protests and riots and just civil unrest in general. There will be a subset of the population who goes, you know what? I'd like to go on vacation, but the last thing I want to do is go down to the beach and then some big brouhaha breaks out, or I go to the restaurant and so you might have people waiting, just not out of fear of COVID or anything, just want to make sure that things are calm in the country. And so that's what portion is unknown. So a couple things. We're up against the clock here. Wheat, corn, lumber, I know have all had decent retracements. Do you expect those prices to kind of level off now? Will they still keep going down? Because they were out of control. Let's just be honest. They were out of control.
And that was a lot of sentiment that built up when you saw the news. You saw China buying huge old crop, new crops. You saw these shortfalls. Now it's a growing season, so the growing season has caught up a bit. You had, again, the paper market running ahead of the physical market. And now I think you're going to see this hold firm on the grains level where you've had some pullbacks. I think the pullbacks make sense. Now you're going to start to see, well, how are things progressing? How are the other crops moving? And I think you're going to start to see this stabilize a bit at this level. Now, lumber is its own entity and beast, because when you look at the trees, there's enough trees. I see the trees, they're there. They're not getting any crazy prices for those trees. It's the processing. The processing, the sawmills went down because of COVID. They were slow to come back. And you had this pent up demand, obviously, because of housing. Like you said, people were putting add-ons, additions. So you did have a big demand increase. But where else do you need truckers? You need truck drivers in lumber. So not only did you have a sawmill shortage, but you then had a trucker shortage, and both of which have persisted. So the lumber market is very thin, easy to move around. There's different restrictions in it. And I think that there is a lot of paper movement versus what is the actual underlying lumber telling you. But again, I if I'm a betting man, I think lumber continues to fall.
Okay. All right. So it's great to talk to you again. I always
Always a pleasure, my friend.
Learn so much. Try to sound as little stupid. I can't even speak. You make me stupid. Like you, in your presence, I just realized how ignorant of a human I am. So I disdain you for that, but you also teach me a lot. So I appreciate that.
I appreciate that.
Where can people find you? You mentioned your shows. So let's talk about your shows.
Sure.
You have a YouTube channel that you put out shows. What are those shows, and where do you want to send people to? Twitter, YouTube, where?
Sure. So on YouTube, it's Primary Vision Network. We do a EIA show every Wednesday looking at the U.S. data, global data, and putting it all together from an oil and refined product side. the economy show, where we look around the world, looking at macroeconomic data points and drivers, and really trying to say what is going to happen. And then the frac spread show, looking at U.S. completion activity, where things are going. Best place to reach me is Twitter. It's at Mark FNY. Keep it simple.
Okay. And bonus question: have you and Big Oren gotten into it lately?
So we direct message constantly, and it's always fun to go back and forth. I will let you guys come up, shake out your political beliefs. I just want to make sure that I am there when this great meeting happens, because I'm convinced there's going to be a lot of hugging, a lot of tears, a lot of just good drinks and times had by all. But I want to see this happen.
Listen, okay, here's the deal right now. Let's get it on the books. 2022, we're going to Spain, and we're going to go row the bulls, and we're going to go see Big Oren. Let's get on the book right now. I'm going to
as long as I'm drinking something and not running with the bulls, but drinking other people running with the bulls, I'm done.
Run with the bulls. You can watch. You and Oren.
Okay, I'll watch. Okay. I'll watch with Big Oren.
I'm going to Twitter when we get off. I'm tagging him. I got another buddy who wants to go to Spain. Not tied up Big Oren, but it will go.
Yep.
I think Big Oren is probably my biggest fan. He's a kind of a fanboy, if I had to be honest with you. He loves me to death. So yes, he will when we sign autographs, selfies, shine my shoes, all that kind of stuff. So anyways, Mark, it's great to get you on. Thanks for everything. And folks, go check out Mark's work as always. And I think you'll be on again next month. And so we'll talk to you then.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.